Perfect, thank you. All right, so tonight we're moving from the Old Testament into the New Testament. All right, how many books are in the New Testament? 27. What was it originally written in? Greek, right? So it moves into a whole different language, right? One kind of interesting thing, in Hebrew there are no vowels. That's kind of interesting. So I talked about how they had to make accents over everything to get the vowels. In Greek, often it's not written with any sort of separation. So you don't, we put a separation, we put a little space. When we're writing words, we'll write a word, put a space, write a word, put a space. In the Greek, it's just one long string of letters. So you have to go along and go, there's your space, there's your, So it's often a challenge to interpret what's being said, because wait a minute, is it this word or is it that word? And that's just one of the complexities to translating. Any of you guys speak a different language? Spanish, German, French. What else do you guys learn in school? Did I miss one? Japanese? You're doing Japanese? Norwegian? That's a very important language to learn if you're a fisherman. So, anyway, when you translate, that's a challenge, isn't it? It's difficult to get it just right, put it in our words. And so here we're translating Greek. So now, New Testament is in Greek, all right? Okay? So New Testament's in Greek. And we're going to start off with the history books. Remember how we talked that we actually started with the law in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we're starting with the history books. So who can tell me what the history books are called in the New Testament? Anybody guess? They're the first 4 books of the Bible, of the New Testament. Yeah. The Gospels, all right? So, Gospels. And by the way, here's the thing. Who's got Bibles with them? Raise your hands. Okay, so keep your hands up. You're going to look up Luke 2:47 through 49. Write that down. Write this down. Mark 1:22-25. Mark 4:39. Matthew 5:3 through 11. Matthew 5:3 through 11. Who else has got a Bible? Matthew 5:38 through 39. Right? Oh, 40? No, 41. 38 to 41. 5:38 through 41. Matthew 16:24-25. 16:24-25. Matthew 20, verses 25 to 27. You want a big one or a small one? Mark 9:31. Who wants a big one? You don't want one. So you've got Matthew 12:40. Big one, Matthew 25:31 through 40. Write down. That's a good section. Anybody else need one?
Matthew 1:35.
Matthew 25, 31 to 40. And did I give somebody Mark 9:31?
Evan?
What? Which one did I give you?
She looked straight at you. She knew it was you.
12:40. Yep. What did I give you?
Mark 9:31.
Okay. Who else needs one? Matthew 26:2. Anybody else need one?
My hand was him.
Matthew 5:38. Matthew 5:44. Matthew 5:48. Matthew 16:24. Matthew 20:26. Anybody else? One more? All right, good enough. All right. So, we start off with the history books in the New Testament, and they are the history of the New Testament. Now, I told you what happens, what separates the Old Testament from the New Testament. Michael, what separates the Old Testament from the New Testament? The Gospels. But what's the story that really starts the whole New Testament? What's it about? Can you guess? Jesus being born. Excellent. That's exactly right. Nice job. It's one of those times when the Sunday school answer works. Jesus? Yes! Yes! Good job. How did you know? Right? So Jesus being born. So the whole Christmas story starts off in this. Now I want to start with John 1. Do you remember, how does the Old Testament start? What's the book? Genesis. In the beginning. So notice how John starts his gospel. These are one of the 4 history books. Now just, everybody focusing right here, I want you to hear this. You guys are focusing up here? So, the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar. We call them the Synoptic Gospels because they tell the story in similar ways. They tell from different angles. So imagine if you had 3 different authors and they were all telling the same story, but one was a librarian, one was an army general, and one was professor and librarian is kind of what I was going for there. Army general. The other one is a fisherman. You would probably all tell it from a little different angle, wouldn't you? You'd tell the same story, but you'd tell it in a different way. A professor would tell it differently than from an army general. Each would have their own things that are important to them. That's kind of what happens with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They each tell from their own angle, and then it's the same kind of story, and often they're telling the exact same story, but they'll say it in different ways. Okay? Then the last gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, what's the last one? John. John tells it completely different. He's not trying to tell it from a historical standpoint. He's not trying to say it like, if you were like, well, tell me what happened today, and don't leave anything out, because it was really important. If you tried to tell the story, you'd go through and you'd be like, okay, well, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and then this person said this, and this person said that, and then this happened, right? That's how you tell history. John's like more about like the point, the big picture. So he tells it in a story way, but it's much more almost like a sermon. It's almost told in a way that's more a theological understanding. You know, so Jesus is the bread of life. You know, he'll tell stories like that, and it's like that doesn't sound historical. That's got like a bigger intent to it. Okay, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then I'm also going to include the book of Acts, which is short for the Acts of the Apostles. We're going to talk about that later, but that's also a history book. So now, when we look at, we said, Michael, what starts off the New Testament? Jesus. All right. Now, Jesus is really complex. So the person of Jesus is really complex because Jesus encompasses a multitude of different ways of looking at how God is doing something in this world. So you can look at Jesus from the standpoint of prophet, and we're going to talk about that today, how Jesus can be seen as a prophet. So when Jesus showed up on the scene, the people started going, there's a new prophet in town. Remember how I told you there were 400 years of what? Silence. So the last prophet that prophesied, after that there was no prophecy for 400 years. There were no prophets in Israel. And the people noticed. They're like, God's not talking to us anymore. What's going on? You know, the prophets were the ones that talked for God, right? And God's not using prophets anymore. What's going on? There was silence. So when Jesus shows up, it's almost like a bullhorn. The prophet's here. You know, and they're like, there's a new prophet in town. We've got a prophet. Okay? So that's one way to understand Jesus. Now, I also told you that they also were waiting for hundreds of years, they've been waiting for this person. And we call this person what? The
Messiah.
The Messiah. So the Messiah, another way of saying Messiah is anointed one. And they saw the Messiah as a new king. So this new king was going to come in town, and they're waiting for this king. It's better when it's on ice, right? Suckers are much better iced. Quietly iced. So they're waiting for this new king. So you can also refer to Jesus as a king. And we're going to talk about that as well. And then the last one to understand Jesus is he wasn't just a king that came in riding into town to take over, get rid of the Romans, and reestablish the nation of Israel. And he wasn't just a prophet who just came in and started talking to God. He was also someone that led like a priest. What he was about what a priest is about. And we're going to talk about what a priest does. So I want us to remember Jesus from 3 different angles. Prophet, priest, and king. Okay? We're going to talk about that over the next couple weeks. Prophet, priest, and king. So tonight we're talking about Jesus as a prophet. Okay? Now, do you remember what I said a prophet does? What are some of the things a prophet does? Matthew?
Prophesy.
Prophesy, okay. Now, another way to say that, what's a different way of saying prophesy? When you're prophesying, what are you doing, Chris?
Foretells the future.
Okay, so a prophet foretells the future. That's one thing a prophet does. What else does a prophet do? And I already said it today. Yeah? Speaks for God. Okay? So someone that speaks now I want to start there. Because when someone speaks for God, that's a big thing. If I came in and I said, listen up, God just told me to tell you to do this. That's got power to it, doesn't it? If you really believe that that's what just happened, that's got power to it. Another word for power is authority. Do you guys understand what authority is? Your principal has authority. So if your principal says, see me in my office, what does that make you think? Uh-oh, what did I do, right? Or they probably want to give me a medal. That could be the other way, why they want to see you in their office. When a police officer pulls over your mom and dad, and they say to you, you were speeding, the right answer is never to say, no, I wasn't. You never say that to a police officer. You guarantee to get a ticket, right? The police officer has authority. The police officer says, this is what I saw, and my word has authority. Okay? They have power behind their word. So, when the prophet speaks, they have authority. And they have power behind their words. And people go, whoa, you know? Usually the false prophets, they go, I don't really believe you. You know, I don't think so. The real prophets, when they spoke, people listened. Okay? They had power. They had authority. So, Luke 2, 47 through 49. Who's got it? One of you guys, I think, wasn't it? Luke 2, 49. You didn't get one? Well, I was asking at the end and nobody raised their hand. Okay, so Carl's going to run up here to the mic and he's going to say it. And Mark 1, 22 through 25 is going to come up, and Mark 4, 39 is going to come up. So, go ahead and read this passage. If you have it in front of you, you can just follow along. Luke 2. Can you reread from there? Here we go.
And all who heard of him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety. He said to them, Why are you searching for me? Do you not know that I must be in my father's house?
Okay, this story is when Jesus is 12. And he's on a trip with his family. They go to Jerusalem for part of the pilgrimage. Thank you, nice job. And they go to the temple, and that's part of the ritual. And Jesus gets separated from the group. And the whole group decides it's time to go home, and they all leave. And because they're traveling in a community, so the way they traveled back then is kind of like a village. The village would travel to Jerusalem, they'd go there, and then they'd come back. Well, the village kind of took care of itself. So they weren't really worried about Jesus, the parents. But when they got back home, they were like, where's Jesus? You know, oh, I thought he was with you. No, he wasn't with me. I thought he was with so-and-so. No, he wasn't. Where is he? So they run back to Jerusalem, and they find him in the temple. And what's really amazing is when they get to the temple, Jesus is surrounded by all the religious leaders. They're sitting listening to Jesus talk. And it's like, what is going on? Our son, our 12-year-old, our 7th grader, is sitting in the middle of this circle of rabbis, and they're all talking to him and getting answers from him. And so when they come up, they're like, Jesus, we've been looking for you everywhere. Where have you been? And he goes, didn't you know I'd be in my Father's house? And it's kind of one of those like, what? And I'm sure they didn't quite get it, but he's referring to the temple of God, God the Father, that he should have been in his Father's house. So when Jesus is speaking, even at a young age, his word has authority. How many here in this room, how many 7th and 8th graders, how many of you guys, when you speak, everybody listens? Okay. Well, there you go. There's our next prophets. All right. Mark 1, 22 through 25. Come on up. And Mark 4, 39. Come up. If you want, you can read right from here. Okay? Into the mic.
They were astounded at his teachings, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him."
All right, great. So this scene is Jesus is teaching with a huge crowd, and they're all amazed because when he's talking and teaching, you know, when I teach about Jesus, right? I teach about God. No, yes I do. Thank you. So Jesus, though, when he was teaching, wasn't teaching about, he was teaching for. So everything he said was like, it was like you were listening right to God speak. It was like God's mouthpiece was Jesus' mouthpiece. That's called authority. And then the next step of this story, which is really interesting, is Jesus, as he's teaching, there is a man who is possessed. They would say possessed by a devil or a demon. Okay? And this man comes up to Jesus and says, we know who you are. And he starts speaking almost like he's speaking for the demons. And we know who you are, Jesus. You're the Son of God. And then it says, Jesus rebukes him, tells him to be silent, and demands that the demon come out. So in this story, it shows that even Jesus has authority over demons, unclean spirits in this story. So that's power, isn't it? To have the kind of authority, power, that can even tell unclean spirits to come out. Okay, another one? You can read it right from here. Okay.
He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm.
I like that. Completely calm. Excellent. So, here's the story. Do you remember the story where Jesus is out on the Sea of Galilee? He's asleep in the boat, and the winds and the waves come up, and the boat starts shaking and rocking, and these waves suddenly are coming up, and Jesus is asleep in the boat, and the disciples are like, "Jesus, don't you know we're going to drown here? You should help us do something." And Jesus stands up, and he says to the water and the wind, "Peace, be still." He's talking to the water, he's talking to the wind, and suddenly it just goes, shh. And the disciples are just like, what just happened? You know? So to have authority even over elements of the earth, wind, water, right? That's authority. Okay? Don't you wish you could just go out when it's raining and say, "Stop it! I'm getting wet here." Right? Or, "I really want it to be warmer. Can we warm up a little bit?" You know? Having authority to even talk to the sea, to the wind. That's called authority. All right. What else do prophets do? We talked about authority, speaking for God. What's another thing a prophet does? Kind of a special thing, kind of an amazing thing. Yes? Keep going, not that, something else. Yes? Miracles. Turn to the handout I gave you. You guys all got the handout that was sitting on the table over there? If you didn't, you can go grab it. So, on this handout, it does a summary of all the different miracles that Jesus did. Okay, so, different miracles that Jesus did. Do you remember the feeding of the 5,000? Remember that? That story where Jesus has been teaching all day, 5,000, and remember, it's 5,000 men. They only counted the men. 5,000 men plus women and children. So how many people were there? A lot. 15,000, because often they had like 3, 4, 5 kids, right? So 15,000, 5,000 men, 5,000 women, plus women and children. There's a lot of people there. We're talking like Miller Park. Not quite that big. I think they hold 40, right? So they're talking in the outfield. I don't know. Big group. And Jesus has been teaching them all day, and suddenly it's time for dinner. Jesus is finishing up, and the disciples go, Jesus, it's time for dinner. You ended right at dinner time. Probably not a good move. Now we got to feed these people, and tell them to go and find food in the villages. And Jesus says, no, you feed them. And it's like, well, what do you mean we feed them? How are we going to do that? He says, well, gather what they have. And so they gather a little bit of food. Okay, couple loaves of bread, couple fish. And Jesus lifts them up, blesses them, breaks them, and starts to pass them out. What does that kind of look like? What is it symbolic of? Communion, thank you. Nice job. So, starts to pass it out. And it just keeps multiplying. The food just keeps multiplying as they're passing it out to these 15,000 people, yes?
We don't have fish in communion.
We don't have fish. We should do that.
Yeah, that would be
Little herring, that'd be great.
Yeah, we should.
Right? We're missing the herring.
Oh, why do you want to?
Little, what do they call those that you put on pizza?
Anchovies.
Anchovies. That'd be delicious. Okay, it'd make you appreciate the bread that much more. So, as it's being passed out, they all eat, and it says they're all full. So not only did they just get like the little thing that we get at communion, right? The little glass and a little piece of bread, where you're going, I wish I had a little more, right? They eat till they're full. That's probably like a plate worth. And then they collect all the leftovers, and it says they have several baskets full of leftovers. So everybody's just astounded at this miracle, okay? So that's one of the miracles. Calming the storm, we just talked about. Demons, where Jesus pulls these demons out of people, sends them into pigs, and they run into the water and drown themselves. Jairus' daughter is raised, a sick woman is healed. There's a lot of healing that happens, all right? A leper is healed. Do you know what a leper is? Not a leprechaun. No, that's a cereal thing. Yeah. It's a severe skin disease. It's very contagious, right? Where you stop we could ask our doctors in the room, but it really stops you from feeling. Isn't that right? You lose the sense of feeling. So you don't even feel like if your hand gets cut off, you don't even feel it. So some people would say, boy, that's great, I don't feel any pain. That's great. But pain reminds us that, hey, you're on fire. Right? Or, hey, you just stuck your hand onto a knife. That's not good. You're going to bleed to death. Right? So pain reminds us that something's going on. It tells us something. And when you lose that sense of pain, you really can get into danger. So leprosy was a really something they were very concerned about because it was very contagious. If you became a leper, they kicked you out of the community and sent you to a separate community where you had to live with other lepers. And anytime you came anywhere near other normal people that weren't affected, you had to yell, "Unclean! Unclean! I'm coming towards you, I'm unclean!" Okay? I'm sure. And unfortunately, even though leprosy is very treatable nowadays, it's still prevalent in other countries because people don't have medicines there. Okay? So even though it's very treatable, it's still a problem. A boy with an evil spirit is healed. Jesus walks on water. Remember that story? All right, he walks out to the disciples as they're out in their boats. Blind Bartimaeus receives his sight. So even the blind receive their sight. A girl is freed from a demon. 4,000 are fed. That's a whole other story. Hold on to your pencils. Cursing the fig tree. That's a different where the fig tree just melts and dies. A centurion's servant is healed. An evil spirit is sent out of man. A mute demonic is healed. 2 blind men find sight. Jesus heals the mute man. A coin is fished out of a fish's mouth. A deaf and a mute man are healed. And by the way, these list all the different parts in the Bible. A blind man sees the first miraculous catch of fish. This is where, that's the end of John text, I believe, where Jesus says, well, where they're not catching any fish, he says, well, fish on the other side of the boat. Right? Which just sounds really stupid. You know? It's kind of like, well, don't fish on the right side of the boat, fish on the left side of the boat. And they're like, we've been out here all day. We've been left, right. No. And he's like, just try it. And they throw their nets in, and they catch so much fish that they're about to break the nets, they can barely haul it in. So, widow's son is raised. A crippled woman is healed. Jesus heals a sick man. I wanted to get to Lazarus. Lazarus, that second to last one, that's Jesus' friend. He dies. He's in the tomb for 3 days, and Jesus comes and brings him back to life and comes back out alive. Okay? And even his sisters are like, Jesus, he's been in the tomb for 3 days dead. You know, they know what happens to a body when it's been in the tomb for a couple days. Rigor mortis sets in. The body starts to decay. You ever seen food that sits around for 3 days? That's what happens to a body. It starts to decay. It starts to smell. They're like, he's going to smell. You know, you don't want to open up the tomb, right? He's dead. And Jesus says, no, open the tomb. And he calls in. He says, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus walks out all bound up in bandages from being wrapped up in death clothes. So, these are all the different miracles that take place in the New Testament, the history stories of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I just wanted you to have those, okay? I want to flip down to the other side on your sheet. Y'all have the sheet, right? Y'all have the sheet? Flip to the other side where it says the Messiah. Messianic prophecies. So these all come out of the Old Testament. These are all talking about Jesus pointing to this person, this Messiah who's going to come. Notice how similar they look to Jesus. So Micah 5:2 says that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. Where is Jesus born? Bethlehem. It says the Messiah is going to be born to a virgin. Who is born to a virgin? Jesus. Messiah is going to be a prophet like Moses. Messiah is going to enter Jerusalem in triumph. What happens on Palm Sunday? Do you remember how Jesus enters riding on a donkey and everybody's waving their palms and laying their coats down? And they're saying, Hosanna! Hosanna to the Son of David! They're claiming Jesus to be the Messiah when he walks in. Okay? Rejected by his own people, betrayed by one of his followers, was tried and condemned, was to be silent before his accusers, was struck and spat by his enemies, was mocked and insulted, was to die by crucifixion, was to suffer with criminals and pray for his enemies. All these things are prophecies that point to the Messiah coming. They're waiting for all these things to take place. And so when it happens to Jesus, people start to go, that's exactly like the prophecy. That's exactly like what happened, what we've been waiting for, the Messiah. Okay? So, anyway, I wanted you to have that. So, we said a prophet speaks with authority. Jesus speaks with authority. We said a prophet does miracles. Jesus did more miracles than any of the other prophets. In fact, if you probably put them all together, all the other prophets, Jesus did more than all the other prophets together. Okay? Now, I used 2 words. Remember how I flipped them around? What were those 2 words last time? No, that's in the test. So when I talked about it last week about a prophet, what a prophet does, the prophet does 2 things. Exactly. Afflicts the comfortable and comforts the afflicted. Okay? So remember how I said the prophet would always come and afflict the comfortable? Jonah came and said, you're all messing up. If you don't change, in 40 days, Nineveh is going to be dust, ashes. And they all changed, and God forgave them. Of course, Jonah went, what? I want her to be dust. Right? What? Can't hear you. And then he got swallowed by a whale. Okay, who had Matthew 5:3 through 11? Come up here, please. Who had Matthew 5:38 through 40? Come up here, please. Who had Matthew 16:24 and 25? Come up here, please. And if you'd rather read from my sheet, you can read from my sheet. Say it right on the mic. So, this is Jesus comforting. We're going to start with a comforting part. Comforting the afflicted. So people who are afflicted, you guys are listening, right? Hit it.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account.
Thank you. Anybody know what these are called? Anybody know? Blessings? No?
The Beatitudes.
The Beatitudes. It's a special section of the Bible. We talked about it in your rotation. All these people are people who are afflicted. All these people are people that are struggling in life. And Jesus says, blessed are you when you struggle, for yours will be a blessing. Instead, it will be blessings out of curses. Come on up for Matthew 5:38. And if you want to read right from there, you can.
You have heard that it is said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let them have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Okay, does that sound like afflicting or comforting? Good job, thank you. It's actually afflicting. So he's saying, if you've heard it said eye for an eye. So the old saying in the Old Testament was, if somebody ripped out your eye, you had the right to go up and rip out their eye. An eye for an eye, if they took out your tooth, or knocked out your tooth, you could go up and knock out their tooth, and it'd be perfectly legal. Because they did it to you, you could do it to them. Does that ever stop? It never stops, because suddenly you get into this whole cycle of, well, he did it to me, so I did it right back to him. Okay, and Jesus is saying, no, he said, you've heard it said all those things, but I tell you, do not even resist someone. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn and give them the other cheek. Let them strike you on the other cheek. That's not the way we live, is it? It's not the way we live. Jesus he's challenging here, right? Whoever wants, if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let them have your coat as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, instead go 2 miles. All right? Be giving, be caring, be loving. Go the extra mile. I wanted to read a different section here. I think this group over here, you guys had Matthew 5:38. Come on up. Matthew 5:44. Matthew 5:48. Matthew 5:38. Matthew 5:16-24. Did anybody have 16-24? Come on up. Matthew 16:24. Did anybody have Matthew 20, 26? You had that one? Come on up. Who else had Mark 10, 25? Okay, you guys are on. Who wants it? Mark 10, 25. Ellie? Eli? Okay. Now, Matthew 16, 24. You can read first from there if you want. Here's another afflicting one.
Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it.
So, people in Jesus' day were very used to things being comfortable. Follow the rules, follow the Torah, everything will be perfect. And Jesus comes in and really challenges people. He really afflicts the religious, comfortable people. It says, I'm going to tell you something even harder. Okay, I'm going to challenge you to go the extra mile. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself. Take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose their life. And whoever loses their life will find it. This becomes challenging statements. What did you have?
25 and 27.
Okay. So I think I want to hold on to that a little bit. Just Matthew 5:38. Who had it? Matthew 5:38. 44. Come on up. Right to the mic. Go ahead and say it.
538 was already read.
Was it? Oh, that was on my sheet. Yes, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. 44.
Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That is not what we do, is it? That is challenging. Matthew 5:48. Come up. Everybody's listening? 5:48. Yep.
Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
So that's challenging, isn't it? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is. 16:24. Who's got 16? Matthew 16:24. There you go. Right into the mic. You can.
Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me.
All right. Thank you. And then 20:26. I skipped 16:24.
Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant.
All right. That is not the way they were living. Which one did you have? Come on. Okay. Come on up and read it.
You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth.
All right. Thank you. What did you guys have?
25 and 27.
You can sit down. Go ahead and read it. What you have? Okay.
Jesus called them and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord is over them, and that their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant.
Nice. So, especially with that one, Jesus flips everything on its head. Because in that day and age, you wanted to get power. You wanted to be the top of the chain. You wanted to be the most important person in the room. Are we kind of that way today still? Sometimes, right? And Jesus is saying, if you want to be great, you should be a servant to all. That just didn't make sense to the people in that day. That was changing everything. Now, you want to do yours, Matthew? You had the long one. Matthew 25, 31. There's a couple of verses in the Bible. There's a lot of really important verses in the Bible. I don't want to make it sound that way. But there's a couple that are like really important. So we talked about John 3:16, right? Remember we memorized that last year, 8th graders? Oh yeah, right? John 3:16, really important verse in the Bible. This section is considered one of the most important because it becomes a challenge for us as Christians as to what we're going to do. So, yeah, you can just read right there. So listen up. This is really important.
When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his throne of glory.
And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. The king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, that you are blessed, my father. Come, that you are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothes. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." The righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, and we gave you food? Or thirsty, and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger, and welcomed you? Or naked, and gave you clothes? And when was it that we saw you sick, or in prison, and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did to one of the least of those who are members in my family, you did it to me."
All right. So this becomes kind of that challenge for us as to what we're supposed to do. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Okay? And Jesus is saying, the people would say, "Well, when did we do that?" And Jesus says, "When you did it to the least of these, to anyone that you wouldn't suspect, you did it to me." Okay? So this becomes a really important passage for us as Christians, because it reminds us that we're not just supposed to make this into some sort of special, just personal faith. That's important too. But we're supposed to go out and serve, be a servant. If you want to be great, you should be a servant among, just like those among you. But you should also be striving to feed, to clothe, to shelter, to help those that are in need. Okay, help your brother and sister when they're in need. And this story is about getting into heaven. They say, "Well, when did we do this?" When you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Okay, this becomes a crucial passage. Often people talk about Matthew 25 as one of those passages that's just as important as John 3:16. Now, what else did we say the prophet does? There's one more part. One little more part. Yeah.
Prepares the way for Jesus.
Prepares the way for Jesus. That's really good. Who did that?
Huh? Oh, John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. You like sweet or sour? Sweet watermelon. All right. So John the Baptist prepares the way for Jesus. I wanted to talk about what I was looking for, that was foretelling the future. And we kind of said it earlier. Chris said it earlier. But this becomes one of those other foretelling things. So a prophet tells you something that's going to happen. And then it becomes that something that's in the future. So listen to this. Did I give out Mark 9? I don't think I gave out Mark 9. Mark 9. For Jesus was teaching his disciples, and he said to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And after 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." So what's that all about? What happens with that?
Well, he's crucified.
So he's crucified on Good Friday.
Yeah, and then 3 days later on Easter, he's resurrected.
So he tells them it's going to happen before it happens. Now, Peter even says, "No, Lord, that can't happen." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Because you're setting your mind on things that you would want to take place in your world. I'm setting my mind on heaven, on the future, on what God wants for this world. And we know that by Jesus giving his life, he becomes that sacrificial lamb. Right? That perfect lamb, the sacrifice like Moses talked about. Okay? So he tells about how it's going to happen beforehand. Another example, Matthew 12:40. For just as Jonah, remember Jonah, was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. So Jesus uses Jonah's story of being in the whale as an example, almost like a foreshadowing. You know what foreshadowing is in literature? When they kind of use an example, and it's like, that sounds an awful lot like Easter, like the Good Friday story, right? And he even talks about, just like Jonah was in the belly of the whale, the Son of Man will be dead for 3 days before coming back to life. Matthew 26:2, last one. You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming. The Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. So right before Jesus is crucified, he tells them how it's going to happen. Now, do you remember that whole story of the last week of Jesus' life? Do you guys remember? Starts off with the palm branches. He rides into Jerusalem, and everybody's like, "Hey, Jesus is here, the new king. This is awesome!" Everybody's like celebrating. They're cheering him on. They've got him coming in, right? They're so excited. One of the first things he does is he runs into the temple and he throws over all of the people selling stuff in the temple. So they have this precious house, this temple of God, and it's now become this place where they sell all sorts of stuff. And the reason they sell all sorts of stuff is because travelers come to that temple, and when they get there, they want to do a sacrifice. And so they buy the sacrifice. They buy the doves, they buy the lambs, they buy the goats, or the sheep, or the bull, depending how bad their sin is, right, and how much money they have to spend. They buy the sacrifice, and then they take it in, and it's sacrificed for their sins. So there's this whole exchange going on. It becomes this place where people are cheating people out of money. And then you know what a money changer is? Jesus gets really upset at this. If you came into my country, let's say somebody travels here from Africa, and they go, "Well, I've got a T-shilling." You're like, "Well, we don't use T-shillings here. Sorry, that's not worth anything here." And they're like, "Well, I really want to buy some lunch, and I've got 1,000 T-shillings. How can I buy lunch with my 1,000 T-shillings?" And you go, "I'll give you $5 for your T-shillings, even though they're worth 50 bucks. If I went to the exchange store, I could get more money for them, but I'll give you 5 for your shillings." And they're like, "Well, 5 is better than nothing. You know, at least I can use your $5 bill." So the money changers cheated people by giving them very little for their return. Well, then they would turn around and then they'd go and say, "I want my 50 bucks. Right? They'd make money by just changing money. All right? So Jesus comes in, he just starts to throw it all over and just literally taking their tables and throwing them over and turning belts into whips and getting people, and I mean, he really runs in and just upsets everything. Do you think the people were really happy? They weren't happy. And they're like, "Who is this guy? What's he doing?" They're like, "Okay, time to stop this." And the religious leaders who are really getting upset with Jesus, even before this, really start to plot, we need to get rid of him. Okay? So this becomes a big thing. So, during that whole week, it starts off really good, but Jesus has already got his sights set on the cross. He knows he's going to go and hand over his life. Literally lay down his life. All right? Before he is killed. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. All right, so the prophet, and we talk about Jesus as one of the greatest prophet there ever was. Prophet speaks with authority, speaks for God. Comforts the afflicted, afflicts the comfortable, foresees the future, and really becomes someone that paves the way. Okay? So this is Jesus. All right. Good? You guys on overload? Yes, I bet so. All right, clean up your stuff, get your chairs perfect. When you are all